Analysis, we first want to take an overview of the whole example and see where we're at in terms of the key. You know, what our key signature is, what chord we start on, and what chord we end on. So using all that information, what key would you say we are in? A major, good, yes. It's pretty clear, but I just want to make sure you go through the steps, because sometimes you can screw yourself up. By just assuming like it's in A major, and it turns out it's modulated at some point, you're not really in A major, or whatever. So make sure you go through that step. Okay, so if we're in A major, this first chord here, which is A, C, A, E, is what? Just one, yeah. And even when the A moves up to here, we still have the C and the A, so it's still one. We're still, and this one will still hold through until something significant changes. Okay? So, yeah, the B's can be a non-chord tone. You know, looking ahead, we can see now this is a significant change because now A is no longer the bass note, C is the bass note. And so that means what in terms of the chord? It's an inversion. What inversion? First inversion. So that would be a 1/6. And then, as Nectarine said, that B would be some sort of non-chord tone. What kind of non-chord tone? Passing tone, because it's just the bass approaching the dissonance from one direction and leaving it from the same direction. So we call that a passing tone. Now I know that a little bit later we get to A, and so you could think of this almost as like a 1 again, but that's an 8th note. It's on a weak part of the B. It's not really that significant. It's more part of this figure, and so in terms of analysis, you would more likely just think quarter note, quarter note, quarter note, and ignore that A. It's not a non-chord tone. It's still part of the chord, but it's not significant in terms of changing the harmony. Okay? So our next change of harmony is going to come here, where we have B and B and A and F. What would that be? 4. Yeah, that would be a 4 chord. In the key of A, a D major triad is 4. And again, thinking that these 8th notes are not changing the bass position until we get to here, what would this be?
Oh, 1 chord.
4, 6.
Oh, yeah.
A 4, yeah, it'd be a 4, 6, a 4 in first inversion, with, just like here, this being
It would be a passing tone.
a passing tone, right? And the D being a chord tone, but not important in terms of analysis. So we're not going to circle it because it's not a non-chord tone. And then finally coming back to, yeah, 1 on the fermata. And again, that 1 just stays the same. This is still just 1, right? We're still A, E, A, C sharp, still part of the 1. But when we get to here, now we've got something different. This is clearly a different harmony. So what, we've got G sharp, E, B, and D. What chord would that be?
5, 6.
5, 6,
5.
5.
5, 6, 5.
5, 6, 5. Okay, so if I'm in the key of A, my 5, 7 chord is E, G sharp, B, and D, right? And so in this chord I have E, G sharp, B, and D. With the G sharp, the third of that chord is the lowest sounding pitch. So that's why it'd be 5, 6, 5. And then the next chord is what? 1. Yeah. And so let's take a look. Let's see if Johann Christian Bach resolved this properly. Okay. Here's the 7th. He resolves it down by step to the third of the next chord. here's the leading tone. He resolved it up by step to the tonic. So, good for Johann Christian. He's a good boy. Okay, on to this next chord.
It's 5.
We've got E and E and G sharp and B. And yeah, that would be a 5 chord. Now, we could, this next note D, right? We'd probably call it some kind of passing tone, you know. But I just want to make you, I mean, in terms of what we've been doing, we've been analyzing quarter, quarter, quarter. But, so as that goes from 5, you could also think of this kind of like a 5, 4, 2, right? Because that's the 5 chord first, then this becomes the 7th as it moves downward. Does that make sense? So depending on how you wanted to analyze it, I mean, I would analyze it as a passing tone. But I just want you to be aware that that is the 7th. That eventually resolves down to the 3rd of the next chord, which is the tonic triad. So even as a passing tone, that 7th is still regarding, you know, is still respecting the rules or following those voice leading rules. And that's just because it's a natural tendency. If you have a certain melodic line, it's going to follow that still pattern still. Does that make sense?
Chord is 1/6 chord.
Yeah, the next chord is a 1/6 chord. And if you were doing analysis and you had a 5, 4, 2, it would resolve to a 1/6, right? That would be the normal thing. So I just want to point that out to you. And I didn't mention it, but the book also goes into discussion of the approach to the 7th. And since we did non-chord tones last time, it's just worth mentioning the 7th can be approached like this as a passing tone. You know, it can sometimes end up, how can I say it? The 7th is a dissonance, right? So when we were talking about non-chord tones the other day, those are mostly dissonant notes. They're not part of the chord, so they're dissonant. And so the 7th is also approached and resolved similar to a non-chord tone. So sometimes the 7th will be a note that's held over and then resolved down by step, like a suspension. Sometimes the 7th will be a passing tone that shows up in a moving melodic line. Sometimes the 7th will be approached like an appoggiatura. You know, it's leapt to, but then still resolved down by step. So the 7th has this kind of non-chord tone quality to it as well, if that makes sense, because of its dissonant nature. And so it's usually approached and definitely left like a dissonant non-chord tone, by step, down by step. Okay, so again, this is a 1/6 because we have the tonic triad with the C sharp, the lowest sounding pitch of the bass. And then we get to here. What is that chord? This is a weird one. Any ideas?
It's retardation.
There's a suspension of kinds, or yeah. But what's the main harmony here? What would you say that this harmony
It's
is?
5.
Yeah, it's a 5 of some kind. Okay. We're obviously getting to the point where we're doing 5 to 1, right? We're coming to our final cadence. So this is 5, and that's evidenced by the E that's down here, which is the dominant, and the G that's up there. That's the 5th of that same chord. Okay? So that in itself would almost form a 5 chord. The only thing we'd be missing is the G sharp, which comes a little bit later, but eventually gets there. Along with, when that arrives, this note D arrives there. So really it's almost like at that point we have 5, 7. And then eventually 1. So we just have to figure out what all this stuff in the middle here is. But can you see the broader movement there? From 5, or even if you wanted to call this 5, 7, eventually moving to 1, it's the fact that Bach ornaments it with first this thing, which I would say it's a suspension. Even though first he goes down to the F sharp and then eventually gets here, the main movement is this. It's taking that note and resolving it down by step here, but he ornaments it with that F there, almost like a changing tone or a neighbor group, almost like a neighbor group, you know, leaping to another distant note and then finally to the thing. But it's combined with the suspension. So the main movement is suspension there. And then as far as non-chord tones are concerned, actually the seventh is really introduced there, so I think it's best to say this is 5/7. This is a chord tone, this is a chord tone, this is not. What could we call that as far as non-chord tone?
It's a neighboring tone.
A neighboring tone, right. Because that's ornamenting the seventh. And then finally, on this beat, we get 5/7 and then 1. So when that is ducking around. When we finally get to that last chord, we have this. And our resolution. But for that last, there's a suspension. And then that ornamented resolution. But the main movement is suspension, resolution, and that makes sense? At the same time that suspension is resolved, the seventh really comes into play, and finally it resolves to 1. And this other stuff is really just kind of ornamentation. So you have to kind of look at the broader harmonic rhythm. Any questions or comments?